right, we are now going to begin the very thorny issue of slavery in Texas. And this is one of those topics that I really wish we could discuss in class, in person, rather than for you to just watch an online video and then tell me your thoughts on paper. But here we are. So before we get into this issue, we need to back up a bit. So let's review and get to where we are now in Texas history. So we've already talked about the war with Mexico, and the two major things that led to the war with Mexico were annexation of Texas and manifest destiny. Okay, so those two big things, Texas becoming a state, being added to the Union as a slave state, and manifest destiny, this whole idea that the U.S. was destined to reach the Pacific coast, to spread their land and their influence from coast to coast, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They felt like they were entitled to this land. And so that led to the war with Mexico. Otherwise known as the Mexican-American War, and that was from 1846 to 1848. And then the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 1848. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo essentially said that Mexico, well, in that treaty, Mexico agreed to cede their land, to hand over the northern third of their land to the United States. So modern day California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, part of Colorado, a little bit of Wyoming, and the ceding Rio Grande as the border, the official border between the United States and Mexico. Because remember before, Mexico said, oh no, the border between Texas, now the US, is at the Nueces River, not all the way to the Rio Grande. And so now they're saying, okay, fine, the Rio Grande is the natural boundary between the United States and Mexico. Okay, so that's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But then, as you found out from last week's lesson, that Texas continued to have border disputes, but not with Mexico this time. With New Mexico. Texas was saying that pretty much half of the New Mexico territory was part of Texas. And the people of New Mexico were saying, no, we don't consider ourselves Texans. This is New Mexico. And so with that border dispute, that led to the Compromise of 1850. And in the Compromise of 1850, California was added as a free state. So California was a big chunk of the land that Mexico had handed over to the United States. And so, CA for California, California was added as a free state. And then they also agreed, so just east of California, we had the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. And so they agreed to organize those two territories, but to allow those territories to decide for themselves on the slavery question. So instead of banning slavery in those territories, they said, okay, since we added California as a free state, that kind of tipped the balances in favor of the northern free states in the Senate. Versus the southern slave states. And so they said, okay, as a compromise, we'll say that New Mexico and the Utah territories can decide that question on themselves. Okay, so New Mexico and Utah territories organized and decide for selves. So they decide on slavery question. For themselves. Okay? And then they also decided to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. They didn't abolish or ban slavery itself from Washington, D.C., but they did abolish the slave trade. So they abolished the slave trade in D.C. And then back to this question of the border dispute between Texas and New Mexico, they said that Texas had to give up that western land to the New Mexico territory. And so now, remember, Texas entered the Union as a slave state. That means that all of that western territory was no longer slave territory. It was handed over to the New Mexico territory, which could decide for itself on whether or not to become a slave state or region. So Texas gives up western territory. Which is now free. No longer slave territory. And then the other part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that even if you were a slave and you escaped from a slave state to a free state, that you could still be captured. And American citizens by law were required to help return fugitive slaves, runaway slaves, back to their owners. And if they didn't, they could be punished with the same kind of punishments that were given to runaway slaves. So really terrible law. So this was the Compromise of 1850. Now, you'll notice something. Every single one of the provisions of the Compromise of 1850 have to do with what? So California added as a free state. New Mexico and Utah territories organize and decide on the slavery question for themselves. They abolish the slave trade in D.C. Texas gives up its western territory, which is no longer slave, it's now free territory. And then we have the Fugitive Slave Act. And so, question number 2 on your handout, the Compromise of 1850 was trying to deal with what major question? Slavery. Henry Clay is the person who authored the Compromise of 1850. And he was trying desperately to avoid a civil war over the issue of slavery. And as we know from history, he was not successful. So how did slavery develop in Texas? Remember, Texas used to be part of Spain. And Spain never condoned slavery. If you remember way back to first quarter, when we learned about Columbus and his journey to Central America and the Caribbean, when reports got back to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain that Columbus was actually enslaving the people of the Caribbean and torturing them, they were appalled and they withdrew their support from him. And so Spain never allowed slavery in their colonies. And then even when Mexico gained independence from Spain, they still shared that value. They did not condone slavery. However, if you remember, during the colonial period, which was in the 1800s, Mexico had such a hard time trying to colonize Texas and trying to colonize their northern lands that were so far from Mexico City. And so they hired people called empresarios to recruit people from other lands, from Mexico, from Europe, from the United States, to come into the land. And so they knew that these colonists were coming in from the United States in droves. Lots of people, remember, they were escaping debt, escaping problems, also looking for adventure and freedom and whatnot. And so they were coming into Texas, and many of them were bringing slaves with them because slavery was allowed in the United States at this time. So even though slavery was against the law in Mexico, they kind of turned a blind eye to the colonists coming into Texas, and they allowed it because these colonists were bringing slaves, and these slaves were working on the land, and it was improving and increasing the agriculture industry there. And so U.S. colonists brought slaves with them into Texas. And again, it was against the law in Mexico, but they turned a blind eye to it. Now, then Texas wins their independence from Mexico, and so even more slaves were brought into Texas. Because remember, in the beginning, Mexico turned a blind eye to slavery, but then they decided, you know what, there are way too many U.S. colonists coming into the land. There's too much of a U.S. influence here, too many Anglos here. So they decided to say, okay, now we're going to put our foot down and we're not going to allow slavery anymore. And so then the people revolted. You know, that was one of the reasons why. And they won their independence in 1836. And so now that the door is wide open, it's no longer against the law. More and more colonists were coming into Texas, and they brought more and more slaves into Texas. And then when Texas was annexed as a state to the United States in 1845, even more slaves were brought in, because Texas was added to the Union as what kind of state? As a slave state. So we can even put that in here. So Texas was added as a slave state. So more slaves were brought in. And then as the cotton industry began to grow, the slave population grew. And at one point, the slave population was increasing at a much faster rate than the free population. Now, if you were a slave in Texas, what kind of rights did you have? Not many, really. So slaves did not have any property rights. They had no rights. They could get married, but a husband and a wife could be separated if an owner decided to sell the husband or the wife to somebody else. They were not legally bound to sell both of them together. So no marriage or family rights. So children were taken away from families of slaves. So no family or marriage rights. They were not able to vote. And they had no way to achieve freedom. There was no pathway to say, okay, well, if you serve as a slave for this long, then you can get your freedom after this many years. There was nothing like that. So there was no right to freedom. So no guarantee of freedom. Now, not all people of African descent were slaves in Texas. There were people who lived in Texas who were free. And so those free people of African descent, under Mexican rule, they had full legal rights as anybody else. But that all changed once Texas became a state. Because when Texas was annexed to the United States, as you know, it was annexed as a slave state. And so all of those free Africans who lived in Texas lost many of the rights that they used to have under Mexican rule. And so they were no longer considered, they did not have full legal rights because they were not considered full U.S. citizens. Okay, so they lost the rights that they once had. Now you'll remember that many of the people who were coming into Texas from the United States during the colonial period, during this time of westward expansion, many of them were coming from the South. And that's why we had such an increase of the slave population, because many of the southern states um, favored slavery, whereas the northern states did not. So the northern states were considered free states, and the southern states were considered slave states. Now, the reason behind that is the southern states were mostly, it was mostly an agrarian economy, meaning that we had plantations, cotton farms, tobacco farms, and they depended on slaves to do all of that work so that they could make the profit. In the north, they did not have as much of a farming economy. In the north, we had more industries, more factories, and so they did not depend on slaves to do the work since they had these factories. But most of the people who lived in the north were against slavery. And so that's why when California was added as a free state, the Northerners thought that was great, the Southerners did not. And so that's why Henry Clay came up with this compromise to then say, okay, well then these territories here, they get to decide on the slave question for themselves. Texas, however, is added as a slave state. So Henry Clay was actually the author of another compromise about 30 years prior to the Compromise of 1850. He was actually known as the Great Compromiser because of this. So back in 1820, he came up with the Missouri Compromise, which stated that Missouri was going to enter the Union as a slave state. As a compromise, Maine was entered as a free state. Another part of that compromise, though, was they said, okay, from now on, anything above the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel, which is right about here, so that line of latitude, the 3630 line here, they are saying everything north of that will be free from now on. And so that's what the Missouri Compromise of 1820 said. And so then fast forward, we come to the Compromise of 1850, which says, okay, Texas is south of that line, so that's going to enter, and they already were a slave territory, and so they entered as a slave state, so that agreed with the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. And then California enters as a free state. Now, it's kind of above and below that line, but remember, the compromise didn't say that you couldn't have free states south of that line. They just said that you can't have slave states above that line, except for Missouri here. But then in the Compromise of 1850, you may remember from your reading that Henry Clay kind of passed the baton off to Stephen Douglas. And so Stephen Douglas pushed that compromise through. And if you remember from reading the primary sources a few weeks ago, that Stephen Douglas was pro-annexation. He was pro-annexation of Texas, and he was also very pro-manifest destiny. So he believed that it was the United States' destiny to expand westward all the way to the coast. And so then he came up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, I think it was. And so what he said in the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that these two states could decide that they needed to be added to the Union, but they could decide on the slavery question for themselves. And so this whole idea of allowing territories to decide on the slave question for themselves is called popular sovereignty. Now, the Southerners thought that was great because they said, hey, we can get another state added as a slave state if they decide that for themselves. Now, they pretty much knew Nebraska was going to stay a free state because it was so far north, but Kansas is right next to Missouri, which was a slave state. And so once that act went through, that caused a lot of tension between the northern free states and the southern slave states. The Northerners, actually some abolitionists, so people who were against slavery and wanted to abolish slavery, they actually sent people to go live in Kansas to try and populate it with people who wanted Kansas to be a free state. Well, then people in the southern states heard about that, and so lots of people from Missouri and other slave states poured into Kansas to vote in their elections. Now you may ask, is that legal? No. However, they tipped the elections in favor of being a slave state. And so then Kansas became a slave state. And that led to a lot of fighting and battles within Kansas between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery people who lived there. And so there is a thing called Bleeding Kansas because so many people were killed on either side over this particular issue. The Missouri Compromise. When was this? This was in 1820. Remember, the author of it was Henry Clay. If you remember, Henry Clay was actually anti-annexation of Texas because he feared that it would spark a war with Mexico, and he didn't want to add another slave state to the Union. And the Missouri Compromise, remember, this added Missouri as a slave state. So MO is Missouri. So that was added as a slave state. And then Maine, which is ME, Maine was added as a free state. But then after Missouri was added, they decided in the Missouri Compromise that slavery would be banned above or north of the 3630 line of latitude. So banned slavery north of the 3630 parallel. The Compromise of 1850, 30 years later, obviously that was in 1850. And Henry Clay was also the author of that. But then you'll remember he passed the baton to Stephen Douglas. Who pushed the Compromise of 1850 through. And so, remember, Stephen Douglas was pro-annexation of Texas, pro-Manifest Destiny. And so the Compromise of 1850, we've already been through all the different provisions of that. But the big idea is that they allowed, while they added California as a free state, they allowed the New Mexico and Utah territories to decide for themselves how they would deal with the slavery question. So allowed new territories to decide slave question for themselves. Rather than banning it altogether. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act came just a few short years later in 1854. Stephen Douglas was pushing this through. He was beginning to allow people to settle in Kansas and Nebraska. So this is also Stephen Douglas. So he opened settlement to Kansas and Nebraska, and then also allowed Kansas and Nebraska to decide the question of slavery for themselves. This whole idea is called popular sovereignty. So allowed settlement or open settlement in Kansas and Nebraska, and then this whole idea of popular sovereignty, which said that Kansas and Nebraska could decide for themselves on the slavery question. Now, the problem with this, as you will see on the map on your handout, is that both Kansas and Nebraska are north of that 3630 line of latitude. And so once this act went through, the Northerners were outraged. The Southerners thought it was great. But why were the Northerners so outraged? Well, because this act essentially undid the Missouri Compromise. Because the Missouri Compromise said no slavery north of the 3630 line of latitude. And both Kansas and Nebraska were north of that line. And so this opens the North up to slavery. Now remember, Sam Houston, who was the first president of the Republic of Texas, and then later became a U.S. Senator from the state of Texas. And while he was a senator, he actually voted against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the reason he voted against it is he felt that by passing this act, that it would divide the Union. Now, if you remember also, when Houston was the first president of Texas, he immediately started pushing for the annexation of Texas to the United States, feeling that the larger government, the more established government of the United States, would help Texas with a lot of its problems, like debt and, just security and all of those things. And so he was a big believer in the strength of the Union and the Union remaining whole. And so he did not want to see the nation divided over this issue. He knew that the northern free states would be outraged over this act, and that if push came to shove, the southern slave states would try to secede from the Union. And he did not want to see Texas to go back to where it was as a Lone Star state, being off, by itself, separated from the Union. He believed in a strong Union that remained whole. And so then he actually, once this went through, he decided to resign from the U.S. Senate and go back to Texas and run as the governor of Texas. And he ran against a guy named Runnels. So in his run for the governor of Texas in 1857, he ran against this guy named Hardin R. Runnels. And they had very different ideas. Sam Houston, as we said just a moment ago, he believed that the Union should remain whole and that the southern states should not secede or break away from the Union. So, Union should remain whole. And he was against secession. He was against slave states seceding or breaking away from the Union if they didn't get their way. Runnels, on the other hand, he believed in states' rights. So he believed that states should be able to decide for themselves on the question of slavery. So that whole idea of popular sovereignty. And he favored secession. In other words, if the South or the southern states don't get their way, and if the federal government tries to impose a blanket law that the states don't agree with, then you know what? We'll just take our toys and go home. In other words, they will secede, break away from the Union, and become their own country, separate from the United States. And so Sam Houston lost to Runnels in this election of 1857. He lost his run for governor, even though he was a war hero. Remember, he won the Battle of San Jacinto. He was the first president. He was very popular. He lost this. Why? Because what he didn't realize is how much Texans, so many of them at that time, were pro-slavery. And they really believed in states' rights, and because they depended on slavery for their economy. The cotton, and remember, as the cotton industry grew, the slave population grew. And so they really believed that they would rather secede from the Union than give up their right to own slaves. Now, the key concept that we talked about in our last unit when we were covering the Texas Revolution was perspective. Remember, different perspectives on rights and laws can lead to conflict and revolution. And we see the same thing repeating itself here. We have different perspectives from the northern free states, different perspectives from the southern slave states, different perspectives amongst Texans. Some of the people in Texas believed one thing. Different leaders within Texas believed different things. And so I wanted you to read a primary source from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was actually a former slave and abolitionist, so he believed that slavery should be abolished. And he gave a speech on Independence Day in 1852. And so I want you to read this speech from him. And I want you to look for different phrases, different words that show his point of view, his perspective. And tell me in your own words, what is his argument? And so that will wrap up our discussion on slavery in Texas.